Zelensky and the Ukrainian armed forces are now doing what one would expect any combatant to do in any war. They're targeting infrastructure, they're targeting fuel supply lines, issues like that, something which would be part of 101 during the Second World War. But if it is starting to make a difference, then I think that is the only thing which is going to affect Vladimir Putin's stance, because he is. To say that he plays hardball is an understatement which the people of Chechnya would regard with considerable irony, I think. But force is the only language he will understand, because he's seen certainly over the past 3 years, and particularly since Donald Trump returned to the White House, that he's not being forced to do anything else.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1282 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very privileged to be speaking to Eliot Wilson again. Now, Eliot was clerk of the House of Commons from 2005 to 2016, where he worked primarily in the Defence Committee and was secretary to the UK delegation of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He's currently a writer and commentator on politics, international affairs and security and rights for City AM, The Spectator, The Hill, and you're a contributing editor for Defence on the Brink. Eliot, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you for having me.
Now, things seem to be relatively quiet globally on commentary around Ukraine after we had Putin's visit to Alaska and then Zelensky surviving another ordeal in the Oval Office, surrounded by his friendly team from Europe, and I'll include the UK as part of that, and NATO. What did you make of the whole thing?
I think we've hit a stage now where President Trump clearly is slightly nonplussed because things aren't moving as he would like, and he doesn't really know what to do. He said recently that he was taking some time to decide whether it was going to be sanctions against Russia if they didn't move on a ceasefire or peace negotiations, or if he'd just walk away from the whole thing and let them sort it out, as he put it. So I think he's not a man who is either got any patience at all, or is used to having to persuade and juggle between very different and firmly entrenched positions of strategic complexity. So I think he doesn't know what to do. He's talked about maybe there will be sanctions somewhere down the line, but that seems to have gone quite quiet now. I think he's now concentrating on other arenas in which he can perform, sending the National Guard into various cities across the United States, because it seems rather easier than having to sort out a war that he neither understands nor has any particular insight into to bring to a conclusion.
Do you think Trump's going to focus on domestic politics now that we're getting into the run-up to the midterms, and therefore ignore Ukraine and other international topics?
I think that there's going to be an extent to which domestic politics will obviously come more into focus. And I mean, Trump is a unique politician in the sense that he's hardly a politician at all. But he will look for anywhere that will give him instant gratification, essentially. I mean, he talks about, making deals and his cherished authorship of The Art of the Deal, which he neither wrote nor, I suspect, has in fact read. But this is what he adores doing. He's talked about how this is what he does for fun. This is how he enjoys himself. Other people listen to music or appreciate literature or whatever. He does deals. He's not particularly good at it, as his track record shows, but he believes he is. And so I think if something were to pop up unexpectedly from the Ukraine crisis, which offered the opportunity of some kind of, superficial win, then he would take it. But I think, yes, there is an extent to which he's now looking at how he can continue to expand his control over parts of the government and the constitution over which the president has not traditionally had control, and to the extent to which he can also hammer the Democrats, who are, in fairness, apparently unable to organise any kind of opposition except possibly in the shape of Gavin Newsom recently. So, yeah, I think there will be a decline in his interest in Ukraine unless he can see something in it for him.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I've been watching Trump and Putin for a while, and it's to me, it's been quite clear that Putin's been stringing Trump along. But then in a recent article in the Times, J.D. Vance insisted that Putin isn't stringing Trump along on the peace talks, and claims that Russia has made significant concessions, like accepting Ukraine's territorial integrity. Do do you actually think there's a genuine process in here? Do you think Putin has given any concessions, or do you think this is JD Vance being JD Vance and trying to say what he thinks people want to hear?
I don't think there's any truth in it at all. I mean, as far as I can see, Russia has made not a single concession. They haven't accepted Ukraine's territorial integrity because Putin still wants to absorb large portions of Ukraine into Russia, including those which he hasn't even conquered by military force. He doesn't accept that Ukraine is a separate country or should have the rights of a separate sovereign country. He wants effectively a veto over Ukraine's foreign policy. I think Vance is, JD Vance is not a stupid man. Therefore, the only conclusion is that he's lying. And he knows he's lying, and he's lying for a political effect. That's not hugely surprising. What I think is slightly surprising, although diminishingly so, and slightly depressing, is the extent to which people like Vance will now say anything to fit in with Donald Trump's worldview.
But it's that saying anything is being reported again. Another article by Mark Galliotti. Ignore the bluster. Putin may be open to a Ukraine deal, I think was the title on it. Suggests that Putin might be flexible on security guarantees without necessarily NATO basing inside Ukraine. How credible do you think these quieter signals from Moscow are, especially amid Lavrov's continuing uncompromising demands and the ongoing drone and missile strikes against Ukrainian cities? It seems to be we're hearing different things from different people all of the time.
Well, I mean, if these are quiet signals coming out of Moscow, they are so quiet that, only dogs can hear them. It reminds me a little bit of the way that the Democrats used to talk about President Biden. Oh, no, he's actually really sharp. He's on the ball, except only when we're around. You never see him like that. And there is an element of that kind of discourse that, if only you could see Putin at the right time or understand what he's saying, you'd see that he's actually beginning to shift. I mean, as you say, he is continuing to bombard Ukraine. The war is still in full flow. And in fact, the last few weeks have seen the heaviest airstrikes by Russia against Ukraine of the entire conflict. So if there is some sort of creeping sense of Putin moderating his stance, it's incredibly subtle. And, I think there's a basic point. Is it likely or not that Donald Trump is the only person who can perceive this because it's so subtle? I would have said not. There are clearly others who will disagree, but I think that Putin is playing, from his point of view, a brilliant game because he's been given concession after concession. He's been literally had a red carpet rolled out for him by the President of the United States, despite being wanted for war crimes and an international pariah, and he's had to concede absolutely nothing. There is nothing Russia has given away, and it still cleaves to its the war aims that it had when it began the whole conflict. So I think there is perhaps a degree of wish fulfillment. This has gone on so long, so much has happened that surely something must be happening. But I see no shift in Vladimir Putin's position at all.
But there's pressure being put on Putin. Trump hasn't brought in the international sanctions, and it's interesting. Some of Zelensky's language has been, "Well, we're bringing our own sanctions." We're seeing increasing numbers of attacks against the Russian oil refining and oil storage infrastructure, and the oil and gas pipelines moving oil and gas around Russia and around Europe. And we're seeing pictures of columns of cars waiting outside petrol stations because I think they call it AL or IL 95 gasoline is not available to the general public easily. And your reports that 17% of Russia's oil refining capacity has been destroyed in the last 72 hours by Ukrainian attacks. Do you think Putin is actually worried, and could this push him towards trying to come up with some form of negotiated settlement with Donald Trump where he can get something out of it?
I think this is the only thing that will move him. I mean, actual military pressure, which brings with it economic pressure. I mean, it's interesting that, as you say, Donald Trump has talked a lot about sanctions. He's not actually introduced any new sanctions on Russia. He could do so. It's very clear to me that he has absolutely no desire to do so. He doesn't want to be at loggerheads with Putin because Putin is his friend in some bizarre way, insofar as he has friends. But I mean, it's interesting that, Zelensky and the Ukrainian armed forces are now doing what one would expect any competent to do in any war. They're targeting infrastructure, they're targeting fuel supply lines, issues like that, something which would be part of 101 during the Second World War. But if it is starting to make a difference, then I think that is the only thing which is going to affect Vladimir Putin's stance, because he is. To say that he plays hardball is an understatement which the people of Chechnya would regard with considerable irony, I think. But force is the only language he will understand, because he's seen certainly over the past 3 years, and particularly since Donald Trump returned to the White House, that he's not being forced to do anything else. Why should he concede anything when all he gets is not even harsh words? He actually gets party invitations. So that would make a difference if America were to be serious about economic sanctions, putting the squeeze on fuel, on logistics, things like that. But I see no evidence that America is going to do that. If Ukraine can step up to the plate and do some of it itself, that's good, and it may make a difference. But I still suspect that Vladimir Putin will be able to, or will seek to be able to, at any rate, carve out an incredibly superficial sort of submission to any kind of strictures, and will try to present Zelensky as the one who is immovable in these, as he always has done.
Well, it's interesting. President Zelensky himself has said that on the front lines, he's not going to be able to take the eastern Donbass region back by military force, and that's military logic. If you've got on paper, significantly larger force, which the Russians have, you're not going to be able to deal with them at that tactical level. And then at the strategic level, a lot of the movement, one way or the other, is being dictated by Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin's relationship, but President Zelensky is trying to play off other world leaders to get what he needs for that strategic level of support. And it's this operational level that it joins the two together. That is the level that enables a country to continue to fight the tactical battle and influence what's going on strategically, that the Ukrainians seem to be focused on. And they're focusing a lot of their new technology development and everything else at that level. Who do you think's winning there?
That's a very difficult question, isn't it? I think it's perhaps easier to frame it in terms of who isn't losing. The Ukrainians are on the back foot to an extent that perhaps they weren't a couple of months ago, because the Russians have made some gains on a very tactical level. But again, I mean, I'm sure we've talked about this before. It's descended into this weird kind of almost World War I state, where you are bickering over individual villages of a clutch of houses which have no significance in themselves, except they're a marker on a much larger battlefield.
Yeah, and UK Defence Intelligence, I think, has said to take the parts of the Donbass region by military force, using the rate of advance that the Russians have done in the last 3 years, will take another 4 years and 1.9 million casualties. And that's putting it into context. I think it rocked Donald Trump whenever he was shown that this is almost the size of Florida, if not slightly bigger than Florida, and that the Russians are nowhere near the tactical capturing of it. So that's why the Ukrainians are focusing on that operational level.
I think that's right. I mean, I think we've seen that this is not going to be a war which ends suddenly with a dramatic loss or gain of territory. I mean, that may have been true after the first 10 days of the war back in February 2022. But it's one of the problems, I think, is that we're stuck in this weird world in which several groups of people are all talking about different things. The Ukrainians, understandably, are focused on what is happening on their eastern border in the part of their country which has been invaded by an aggressor. But they're also having to deal with the wider diplomatic situation, and Zelensky is very aware of that. President Trump is dealing with his own view of the world, which rarely coincides with anyone else, but is centered on him and what he's achieving. And Europe is still talking about this. What will happen after there is a peace agreement, which is fine. It's good to plan long term, but it's like planning for your retirement when you're suffering from a broken leg or something. There are more important things to focus on, and we are so far from any kind of peace agreement which would allow the sort of planning for a coalition of the willing, a reassurance force, call it what you want, actually to play any part. That for that to be assuming a large sort of picture in your mind it seems to me bizarrely disproportionate. I can only assume that it's because it's something slightly comforting for European leaders to focus on because it's something they can control.
Well, can they control it? There's a lot of talk about it. Again, in one of the Times articles, the one that was titled "U.S. may help Ukraine with air defense after the war," it detailed a 15-kilometer demilitarized zone with European peacekeepers, is the word they said. And recent Washington Post reports on Zelensky pushing for guarantees within 7 to 10 days amid renewed missile attacks. Do you see that there is actually a viable path to winning the peace? And if there is a peace, do you think that we're actually going to see peacekeepers or even European troops on some other mission on the ground inside Ukraine? Or is this mainly pie in the sky?
I think it's mainly pie in the sky. I think it allows Western military leaders and their political masters to sort of think about scenarios over which they have control because they are imaginary. I think one of the problems, or the fundamental problem with even trying to conceive of a peace settlement and a sort of peacekeeping or reassurance force afterwards, is that it depends on two things, which I think are deeply improbable. If you make peace with somebody, you have to either be able to trust them to keep it, and we know that we can't trust Vladimir Putin to keep a peace, or you need to be convinced that you can deter them into keeping it or force them to keep it ultimately. Now that leads on to the second proposition, which is that if it all goes wrong, in the worst case scenario, we are talking about, is Donald Trump going to authorize US airstrikes against Russian positions? Because that's the ultimate backstop. He's deploying F-35s to Romania. He's talked about possibly supplying, airborne intelligence, reconnaissance, that kind of stuff. But what it comes down to is, if the Russians were to breach some kind of arrangement over a border or a demilitarized zone, would America bomb them? I don't think they would. I don't think Trump would make that call, but that's the question that we have to answer. Essentially, that's what it comes down to.
So why do you think Keir Starmer, with Macron and his fellow leaders from European nations, this supposed coalition of the willing, are putting so much effort into talking about what they will do? Is this not aimed at the reality of what's going on the ground in Ukraine, but aimed at the reality of trying to keep Donald Trump on side from a political perspective, or not to let him go off down a tangent that would be very difficult to come back from?
I think there are a number of different things, some of which are more understandable and admirable than others. I think there is an element of desperately trying to keep Trump not only engaged, but roughly speaking on side, keep him from completely flipping and saying that actually Zelensky needs to go and that Ukraine should be Putin's, because why shouldn't it? Because it's next door to him anyway. So I think that's understandable. It's not the most creditable piece of statecraft that anyone's ever committed, but it probably has to be done. I think there's also an element for Starmer, and probably for Macron as well, who has an awful lot of domestic problems at the moment, that by doing this, by engaging in this coalition building, by keeping this at the forefront of public opinion, they look like they're doing something on the world stage. Prime ministers love doing things on the world stage. Very quickly, most prime ministers get bored of domestic politics and start looking abroad. Rishi Sunak was actually a strange exception to that. He was really quite bored by most international politics, but most prime ministers find that it's much nicer to sort of cut a figure on the world stage. So I think there's an element of that. But I think there's also an element of, it's about all they can do at the moment. I mean, we are clearly not in a position where we're either able or willing to go in so heavily behind Ukraine that we could make a difference on the ground. We're talking a lot about supplying them with air defense and reassurance and that kind of stuff. But we're clearly not prepared to put in a big push to move them towards a more offensive stance against Russia. So in the absence of that, we might as well think about what might happen in a few years' time. I mean, military staffs plan for the future, and if you don't have anything plausible to plan for, you plan for the next most plausible thing, and sometimes that can lead you into slight absurdity. But I think the worry is that because of the way that Starmer and other European leaders are talking about this, that the public, who take a passing interest but can't be expected to scrutinize maps and documents 24/7, start to think that that's a kind of reality. And I think what we need to emphasize is that this sense of there being not only a conclusion to the conflict, but then some kind of imposed, patrolled, policed peace settlement is so far from where we are, if it is ever possible, that thinking about it is not only not going to get you very far, it may actually be unhelpful in terms of your perspective on what's happening in the everyday situation.
But you talk to the reality. Surely Keir Starmer understands the reality of what's going on inside defence in the UK. We would have real difficulty generating the number of troops that he's been talking about putting on the ground, never mind sustaining them. And John Healey must be telling him the reality of what the equipment state is and everything else, having given large swathes of our equipment to the Ukrainians, or suddenly realize that actually it's not reliable enough and not good enough to give the Ukrainians to fight, but there's no plan to replace it. And then we hear the talks of increase of our defence budget to 2.5%, aiming towards 3%, but then deals are done to give the Chagos Islands away, where the cost of that is going to be taken out of the defence budget in the early years. And then we've got the debacle over the Afghan potential compensation claims for the leaks of their details out across the internet. That could cost billions of pounds again, coming from the defence budget. So in effect, we're getting defence cuts while Keir Starmer's promising more defence to be provided to Ukraine. And the reality is we're a long, long, long way off it. Why is Keir Starmer just not seeing that?
It's difficult to know, isn't it? And it's difficult to know whether you hope that he's being misleading to the public rather than misleading himself. But it's genuinely, I can't determine who is under the illusion here. As you say,
you've effectively run the Defence Select Committee. Do politicians frequently mislead themselves?
I think they can, on some levels, force themselves into believing things are better than they are. And I think I have to say that is a particular danger at the Ministry of Defence, and has been for a long time, as you will know, at least as well as I, that there is a kind of bubble in the main building of the Ministry of Defence where things will be all right somehow. And you've seen this over the past couple of years. You've had generals and civil servants and politicians appearing in front of the committee and saying, yes, well, we may have a slight gap in this capability, but it will be replaced in 5 years' time. Things will probably be all right till then. And there is a kind of weirdly crushing sense of optimism. And so far, we haven't been absolutely catastrophically caught out, but that's luck rather than judgment. I mean, as you say, we are currently really struggling to sustain our deployment with the NATO forward forces in Estonia. We've had to reduce the numbers there over the past year or so. And I said this in a Spectator article recently, we have literally 14 guns, 14 artillery pieces for the British Army, some of which are not entirely serviceable because they're being worked on, most of which are deployed to Estonia, but 14 of them.
And very few are 155 millimeter in caliber. So we've got 105 light guns that don't match what the Russians have got, even with what they've lost in Ukraine.
And we ended up, because we'd given away the tracked 155s, we ended up buying some Swedish guns, the Archer system, which was,
which are very good, but
it's fine, but it's not really. The worrying thing is it has no real development stretch in it. I mean, this is as good as it gets, and it will be done in a few years' time. So I think we have massive gaps in our capabilities that we're only really halfway admitting to. The National Audit Office revealed recently that our F-35 fleet was available maybe half the time at best for the missions it's required for, if you took a very generous description of the missions it was available for. So we've got a huge gap in terms of air capacity. We're talking a lot about things we're going to, we've talked about, we're going to buy 12 new hunter-killer submarines. God knows where the money's coming from for that. We have these huge gaps which are going to need to be filled by investment, by spending public money. And yet, as you say, the public money is not being spent. And we are seeing, and this was particularly, I thought, worrying to come out of the national security strategy, we're seeing an awful lot of things which have not typically been described as security spending, suddenly shuffled along to a column whereby it fulfills this 3.5 plus 1.5% of GDP NATO target. But, the Treasury has made it clear that under the current spending settlement, there is no new money for defence. If defence can generate some of its own money, through exports, for example. And there was the recent announcement that the UK had led what looks like a successful sale of Typhoon to Turkey. Then fine, that's a bit more money for defence, but there is no more money coming from central government to the MOD, and so we're trying to make an omelette not only without breaking eggs but without having any eggs in the first place, and it's difficult to see how that's going to work. And yet, as you say, Keir Starmer ploughs on with these grand designs for a reassurance force and a coalition of the willing, and none of the elements of it which are absolutely necessary is in position or seems likely to be in position.
Yeah, again, we hear a lot of cry for accountability in how Ukraine is spending its money and dealing with what it needs for and what has been donated to deal with the Russian threat that's coming in. But we're not hearing that same accountability being called for in Germany because the state of the Bundeswehr is in such poor condition, in France because Macron can't keep his military up to the standards it needs to be, across other European nations. But at home, there's no accountability amongst the political decision makers. But I would argue more importantly amongst those senior military figures and senior civil servants who have made the decisions to say that everything's all right, gov, when it quite clearly isn't. How do we bring accountability back into this?
It's enormously difficult, and it would be an enormously painful issue. I mean, one of the problems, you'll know all of this just as well as I, is that, senior military leaders get moved around so often, every 2 or 3 years, that certainly in procurement terms, for example, if you're starting a big purchase program, you're not going to be there for any significant part of its lifespan in terms of getting from concept to purchase. So there will be plenty of blame to go around. I mean, I said recently that the two armored platforms that we're waiting to put fully into service, the British Army, Ajax and Boxer, both stem from a memorandum of understanding that we signed with the United States in 1996. That's 29 years ago.
I remember it well.
And they're still not fully in service. Now, this isn't helped by the fact that we're recruiting a national armaments director who will revolutionise the process, but still isn't in place because the last person decided that £600,000 a year wasn't worth getting out of bed for. And I have some sympathy with that, given the state of procurement. But there is a more generalised malaise, I think, which is that the army and the armed forces in general will take the view that they are following orders, they're doing their best with the circumstances they have, and therefore they can't ultimately be held accountable. But the politicians will say, well, we're only acting on military advice. And there is there's a meeting point in the middle down which accountability disappears. We have not sacked, certainly in the army, I don't know about the other forces, we haven't sacked a general for being bad at his job since at least 1983, when there was a brigadier who was retired a bit early because he hadn't done brilliantly in the Falklands. But, in those 40-odd years, we have not said to a single general officer, you screwed up there so badly, you are going to be removed from your position. Now, that extends to the civil service to an extent as well. But there are two possibilities. Either we're not doing that enough, or our civil servants and our armed forces are so brilliant that they have not made any significant mistakes for which they should be held accountable. That, I think, is a less tenable proposition. So there does need to be a greater sense of accountability, and I think that would certainly sharpen the minds among civil servants and military officers. I don't think there should be witch hunts. I think ministers do take the overall responsibility, but ministers don't manage individual procurement projects. They don't oversee individual military campaigns, and so there has to be a degree to which people have things for which they are responsible, and if they go badly, they have to hold their hands up and say, okay, I need to suffer some adverse consequences because I underperformed.
So if we compare this to history, the parallels between what went on between 1936 and 1938 with Trump coming down the steps backed by J.D. Vance saying peace in our time, and our military sleepwalking through, oh, we're all right, gov. There's not going to be a problem. We'll deal with it in the future. Do you think we're sleepwalking our way into a potential wider European conflict because we're not in a position to deter it?
I think there is a real danger that if Ukraine goes badly, and if it goes badly because we end up either not supporting Ukraine or we sign up to a deal which effectively sells them down the river, we need to think very carefully about the lessons that Vladimir Putin will learn from this. And the only lesson he can currently learn, I would have said, is that if he's tough, if he's resolute, if he doesn't give in, eventually Western Europe and the Americans will give in first. Now, you can see very easily all sorts of relatively minor conflicts that he might seek to insert himself into, which would not be in America's immediate national interests to be involved in a kind of Trump vision. For example, if he put troops as a reassurance force, shall we say, into Latvia to look after supposedly abused Russian minorities, that's an invasion of a NATO partner. That's Article 5, but we know that Article 5A is actually not drafted particularly toughly in terms of its requirements, and B, that the Americans probably will take a view on their own terms of whether or not they want to fulfill their commitments. So I think you will see, if things do go badly in Ukraine, you'll see Russia effectively given a green light, which says, if you tough this one out, if you hang in there, if you are obdurate, if you insist on everything you've wanted from the beginning, if you give nothing, the other countries will either run out of money or run out of interest. And I think that's more applicable as well in the Far East. You'll see that with this is a clear message for China over Taiwan. Taiwan, Trump has said, is just off the coast of China. It's a long way from America. Why are they really that interested? President Xi is watching this very carefully, and he must be delighted at the sort of mood music that's coming out of Washington, which is that if it's not basically 10 miles off Mar-a-Lago, Trump's not interested in the immediate threat to his security, and that he certainly is not going to put himself out to defend people whom he probably puts on his almost limitless list of people who've done the US wrong and have somehow cheated them. So I think if we don't stand up, as we have done to an extent for Ukraine so far, if we are not clear about we cannot accept the absorption of parts of Ukraine by Russia and the diminution of Ukraine's sovereignty by Russia as the aggressor in a war, we're sending a very, very dark signal for the future.
Well, on that very dark signal, Eliot Wilson, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Times Radio Frontline, and I think we're going to have plenty of opportunities to talk again.
I suspect so. Thanks very much.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.